Stacy A. Scott has been the public defender of the 8th Judicial Circuit since 2010. Before that, Stacy served as an assistant public defender for 10 years. She was also an assistant state attorney and worked in the private sector as a criminal defense attorney. Since taking office, she's been a strong policy advocate in Tallahassee on issues related to criminal justice and funding for public defenders. She's a member of the legislative team working on behalf of FPDA, the Florida Public Defenders Association. Currently, she's the president-elect of FPDA and chairperson of the Appropriations Committee. Stacy received the 2017 Craig Stewart Bernard Outstanding Service Award for her service to FPDA. Stacy has also received 3 President's Awards for exemplary legislative advocacy on behalf of public defenders. Stacy has participated in regulating lawyer conduct by serving 2 terms on the Florida Bar Grievance Committee and serving on the Florida Bar's Commission on Review of the Discipline. Stacy earned her J.D. with honors from the University of Florida College of Law in 1995 and holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Florida. Welcome, Stacy.
Thank you.
You are a double gator.
Yes.
Before we get into the details of being a public defender and that, I wanted to learn just a little bit more about you. And when did you decide that you were going to become a lawyer? Did you always dream about being a public defender, let alone the public defender? Tell me how that all came to be.
I never dreamed of being a lawyer. When I was a kid, I always wanted to be a veterinarian. I love animals, and that was my dream from the time I was very young. My dad is a lawyer. He has a law firm in South Florida, and I think there was a strong push for me to go to law school. But I came to UF as pre-vet and then quickly realized I'm not that great at math. Calculating a tip, no problem. Calc 2, a little more problematic.
Yeah.
So I switched majors to anthropology, and then I went to law school, not really knowing what kind of law I wanted to do. I just knew that I didn't want to sit behind a desk, and I wanted to do something that helped, something that was service. I thought of environmental law at first, and then I took a class called Trial Practice at the University of Florida Law School, and that's what really crystallized what I wanted to do. I knew then I wanted to be in the courtroom, I wanted to do trials, and then I took the public defender clinic, and that's where the light went on. I said, yep, this is exactly what I want to do. I interned in the public defender's office here in Gainesville, and from that moment on, I knew that I wanted to be a public defender.
So from veterinarian to anthropologist to lawyer, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Well-rounded.
Tell me a little bit about kind of the origin of public defenders. You know, in my consciousness, you've always existed. Public defenders have always existed, but that hasn't always been the case in the United States. So tell us a little bit about how it evolved.
Sure. So in our Constitution, there is a right to counsel that's contained in the 6th Amendment. What is not explicitly spelled out in the Constitution is whether or not the government has an obligation to provide someone a lawyer when they can't afford an attorney. So prior to 1963, there weren't public defenders, and private counsel were appointed to represent indigent people only in very limited circumstances.
By severity of the case, like
right.
Capital crimes?
Capital crimes, yeah. Or if someone suffered from a mental infirmity where they couldn't make their own decision, or in some juvenile cases. But in 1963, there was a pivotal case decided by the Supreme Court called Gideon v. Wainwright. Which is a really interesting case. It actually originated out of Florida, where Clarence Earl Gideon was kind of a petty criminal who was charged with burglarizing a pool hall in Panama City. And when he went to court, he asked the judge to appoint him a lawyer. And at that time, there was no right to have a court-appointed lawyer in that type of case. And Gideon insisted there was, and the judge denied it. He went to trial, was convicted, was sentenced to the maximum, and was housed here in the 8th Judicial Circuit at Florida State Prison at Rayford. Mm-hmm. From that prison cell, he wrote an appeal to the United States Supreme Court, arguing that he was denied the lawyer that he believed he was entitled to, And at that time, he was not, but the court took his case and finally made the decision that lawyers are not luxuries, that part of the fundamental Sixth Amendment right to counsel included having counsel provided for you if you could not afford counsel.
So the Sixth Amendment kind of had an intention, and Gideon kind of clarified exactly, what that right was, and that's how public defenders started popping up all over the United States. Public defender offices. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the mandate from the Supreme Court was that people were entitled to counsel if they could not afford counsel if they were facing a loss of liberty. The way each state decided to implement that mandate was completely different. So, for example, in Florida, there was a decision to make a statewide public defender system. So
as opposed to appointing different lawyers or having volunteers?
Right, as opposed to just randomly appointing private lawyers or having the public defender system be county by county. We have 20 judicial circuits in Florida, and there are 20 elected public defenders and 20 elected state attorneys in the state, and that's how the state decided to implement the system.
Gotcha. So tell me, in general, what kind of cases do you handle? What is typical, or is there such thing as typical? What do you primarily do in terms of cases?
Sure. Well, we represent people in every manner of criminal case, all the way from death penalty cases where we defend people facing the death penalty, all the way down to juvenile cases and everything in between. So misdemeanors, criminal traffic cases, felonies, any manner of criminal case. We also do some civil cases where people are entitled to counsel. So, for example, someone who might be facing a Baker Act petition where a doctor alleges that they are suffering from a mental illness to the extent they can't take care of themselves or they're a danger to themselves or others, a petition can be filed to have them committed, and we represent the people who are the subjects of those petitions as well. Automatically.
I see. Yeah. Interesting. Now, I know because I watch Law and Order that the Miranda rights say you have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you. But I've always wondered, is the decision to take on a case as a public defender income-based? Is there a financial litmus test that determines whether or not you're qualified for a PD?
There is. So it's the obligation of the court to determine whether or not someone qualifies for our services. And they have to be indigent, which basically means that your income is less than 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, and or if you have certain statuses, like if you're disabled, you might automatically qualify for a public defender. But people who wish to have a public defender have to fill out a financial affidavit. It's a one-page document that's filed with the clerk, and then the judge reviews it and determines whether or not they qualify for our services.
That's interesting. So I can't just say, no, I don't want to pay for a lawyer, I want a PD.
Correct.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about your funding. I know a little bit about it. I know how some of your funding works, but can you kind of go over all the different ways you receive funding?
Sure. The bulk of our funding comes from the state of Florida, and that is for salaries and benefits of our employees. So all of our employees are state of Florida employees who are part of the Florida retirement system and get health insurance and all the things that come along, the great benefits that come along with being a state employee. So that's the vast majority of our budget. It's about $7.5 million a year. We have 75 FTEs or full-time positions.
And that includes lawyers and administrative staff?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have about 40 attorneys among that 75, and the rest are support staff, investigators, clerks, things of that nature. But I have a budget director, in which I couldn't live without.
Right.
But there's also some other funding that comes where the counties support us. So, for example, Alachua County is a great supporter of the Public Defender's Office. The counties are obligated to provide our IT support and our physical building. So the county provides us with a building. It's a great one, pretty new one that we love. To pay the light bill, to our phones, our computers, providing internet. things of that nature. And so that's an obligation that falls on all of the counties within the judicial circuit, and it's apportioned out based on the county size. So we have 6 counties in the 8th Judicial Circuit. Alachua is overwhelmingly the biggest one, about 66% of the population of our circuit. And then we have 5 smaller, more rural counties that are part of our circuit that also provide some IT support.
What are the counties in the 8th Judicial Circuit?
Baker, Bradford, Union, Levy, Gilchrist, and Alachua.
I was hoping you were going to get that right. You mentioned that you have 75 employees, for the county, for the private sector. Everyone seems to have been having trouble, particularly since COVID, in attracting new employees and retaining employees. Are you facing any of those issues?
Absolutely. We have 75 positions that are authorized. Currently, we're about 10 people down of those 75 positions. In the 8th Circuit, we've experienced unprecedented turnover in the last 3 years. Normally, we're about 8 to 10% a year, which is great. You expect turnover. But Gainesville's always been an extremely attractive place to live and to work. And with the UF and Shands here, we get a lot of people who get anchored into Gainesville, but the last fiscal year we experienced 27% turnover in our attorneys.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, is that mainly going into the private sector, or what is taking them away?
Yes, primarily it's going into the private sector for greater pay, a lot more pay than what we can offer, and or more flexibility in terms of, working from home, Our work is in-person work. Our work is pretty gritty work. We're going into the jails, into the prison. We're in court every single day of the year, and whether it's just first appearances or other court events. And so, I think there's just been kind of a move especially since COVID, where people are like, well, I could make more money and possibly work from home and not have to expose myself or my family to these elements that you have to, that became more concerning after COVID.
Right.
Yeah.
It seems like it would take really a particular dedication to the work to motivate someone to make a career out of that. Do you have some lifers in the office, or?
We do.
Okay.
Actually, just this week, our chief assistant retired after 37 years working as a public defender.
Wow.
A lot of that in the 5th Circuit, but for the last 7 or 8 years here in the 8th Circuit. He was the head of our capital team. And so, yes, there are lifers. I'm probably one of them now.
Right.
But that's harder and harder to come by. And so what we're really looking for are people who have a passion to help others, that kind of like fighting for the underdog, and who are willing really to put service above self, to steal a line from Rotary.
Yeah.
That's really what it's about. It's about helping others and feeling like you're trying to move the needle towards justice through the work that we do every day in the courtroom.
Right. I'm going to ask some questions that I think I probably know the answer to, but are resources an issue, the funding, having enough attorneys for the caseload you have? Are those the biggest issues that you have to deal with?
Yes, absolutely. Being able to pay a professional wage to the attorneys is the #1 issue facing public defenders statewide.
Right.
If we were able to pay our folks more, we wouldn't have the turnover that we're experiencing statewide. Right. I mean, because the benefits working for the state are great. It's just so many people come to me and other elected public defenders across the state and say, I love this work, I don't want to leave this work, but I can't afford to do this work.
Right.
And especially when you look at the cost of living in Florida and how exponentially it's increased in terms of housing alone, we just get people that want to stay but can't.
Right. Right, and I'm sure a lot of them graduate from law school with student loans and have a lot of financial pressure.
Yes.
I want to understand something about the difference between the state attorney's office, and public defenders. So, the state attorney has lawyers to prosecute all cases. Mm-hmm. The public defender defends certain cases if they qualify for a public defender, but what is the difference in terms of the size of the operation of the state's attorney's office and the public defender's office?
Well, that not surprisingly is a subject of debate.
Okay.
If you were to ask the state attorneys statewide, they would say, oh, we do about half of the work that they do, and they do get about twice the funding that we do statewide. However, if you actually survey each of the judicial circuits, it becomes clear that public defenders are representing between 68 and 72% of the defendants that come through criminal court.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, because even if you have a job, you may not be able to afford to hire an attorney. And the judges are pretty respectful of the fact that lawyers aren't luxuries, that it's almost impossible for a pro se defendant to really get a fair shake in court. And if you were to suddenly get charged with aggravated assault, not that you would, but if one were, a private attorney might charge you $15,000 to just as a retainer, and that's not counting the costs of actually litigating the case towards trial. And we all know that most people in our community could not afford that kind of an expense. So there is a balancing test in the qualification affidavit between what are people's assets, what are their liabilities, what's their income, and all of that is taken into consideration. But ultimately, I feel like we're doing about 70% of the cases that come through the circuit.
I had no idea the percentage was that large of people who could not afford an attorney. Can I ask you that annoying question that I'm sure everyone asks you about representing people who are guilty? And I think the question goes something like, how do you sleep at night representing guilty people? What do you say to that?
What I say is, me not being able to sleep at night is not because of that. No. Actually, no, that is a very common question, and the answer is pretty simple. If you believe in our system of justice, then you believe that every single person, no matter what they're accused of or what they've actually done, deserves representation. And that's how we do this work and sleep at night. And even people who have committed crimes, heinous crimes even, they're still human beings that deserve dignity, and they deserve the right to have an attorney and to have a fair trial. And so it's sort of like a surgeon, when someone comes in the emergency room at Shands, the emergency room surgeon isn't saying, well, let me judge you based on who you are and what you do and how did you get here? Like, were you here because you were drinking and driving? Yeah, we don't do that. We're charged with defending people, and no matter what they've done and what they've been accused of, and we do it.
Interesting. And there are so many different levels of, okay, let's say someone is guilty. Well, then, if you're reaching a settlement, there's still a lot of lawyering to do between the state attorney and the public defender on the deal that is made and how long that person may be incarcerated and all of those issues.
Absolutely. There's always circumstances surrounding an event. Oftentimes those circumstances that bring someone to be in court or to have committed a crime are due to mental illness or unaddressed substance abuse issues. And so what we try to do is to get the prosecution and ultimately the judge to see the person holistically, to see all the circumstances that led that person to be in the situation that they were in at the time the offense occurred. And when you look at it from that perspective, then you're able to work out, like, well, what is the justice of this case? What can we do? And it might include incarceration, but what else can we do? Can we try to get someone services? Can we try to send them to a substance abuse program? Can we try to get them consistent on their mental health medications and have some supervision of that so that they don't stop taking them and wind up in a situation again where they themselves could be victimized or where they might be in a situation where they've committed a crime.
Gotcha. How is the caseload these days on average for a public defender? Is it manageable? Is it crazy? What is it?
Well, it's still too high. It's higher than the American Bar Association recommended standards. We handle in our circuit, about 15,000 cases a year for those 40 attorneys.
I'm bad at math. How many is that per
on,
lawyer?
on average, our felony lawyers are carrying a caseload of between 100 and 120 cases at any given time.
Wow.
And the misdemeanor attorneys are a little bit higher. And then we have attorneys who specialize, like we have a specialized attorney for Baker Acts, and she's handling all of those cases.
Mm-hmm.
We have an attorney that addresses our specialty courts, such as Veterans Court and Mental Health Court and Forensic Mental Health Court, which is supported greatly by our county and by our local mental health provider, Meridian. Mm-hmm. So it's high. It's not as high as it used to be. In the mid-2000s, we were at about 25,000 cases per year in the 8th Judicial Circuit. Since I've been the public defender, I have focused on increasing the ratio of attorneys to support staff, so that we have more attorneys than we used to have. And also, though, even though the numbers have gone down, the complexity of the cases has really gone up. And here's why. It's the technology. It's all the body cams, the in-car cameras, the surveillance cameras, the cell phone data and evidence that's available in each one of these cases. We have an obligation to investigate, and it's just so much more time consuming when you have all of this data available that you now have to acquire, store, review, and then
right.
Somehow distill down to how does this fit into the defense of this case. So things are just take longer, and also the turnover really impacts the workload.
Sure.
So every time an attorney leaves my office, I have to reassign those cases to.
They don't clear all their cases before they leave.
They don't, and we have to reassign cases, and then a lot of work has to be repeated. So I know we have so little time left, and I have so much I want to talk to you about, but I know your work with FPDA, the Florida Public Defenders Association. Mm-hmm. I used to do a lot of legislative work for the county, and I know I used to run into you in Tallahassee all the time. But tell us about this year's session coming up, and I know you'll be very involved in it, and what are the legislative challenges that you'll be focusing on this year? This year, our number one priority issue is, again, attorney salaries. We are going to try to advocate to get the starting salary for assistant public defenders raised from $50,000 a year to $75,000 a year, because we feel like that's a much more competitive entry-level salary for right. someone who has 7 years of higher education and student loans. Another challenge for this session is kind of come from left field a little bit, where there's a move from the Speaker of the House to consolidate judicial circuits across the state. And so there's a study underway to look at that issue and whether or not the 20 circuits should be shrunk to 12 circuits or 15 or some number that we don't know, which would kind of create mega circuits. So like the 8th Circuit could be subsumed into some larger circuit as yet to be determined. And so the state attorneys and the public defenders across the state feel strongly that this move is unwarranted, and that there's not enough time to truly study the costs and benefits of such a move. So we feel like that may be an issue in the upcoming session. There's currently a Supreme Court commission to try to look at the issue in the next few months. And then make a recommendation, but that's out there for this session, kind of the wild card of this session.
To what end? Is the Speaker suggesting that it would be a cost-saving consolidation?
The suggestion was that it would somehow save money and promote confidence in the judicial system. So far, they've held 2 or 3 public hearings, and there have been a chorus of voices against it, and not one person, stakeholder, entity has said that, oh yeah, we think this is a good idea. So it remains to be seen how that will play out, but we feel strongly that in the Eighth Circuit we handle our cases efficiently, effectively, and that there is a high amount of trust from the public in our system, because you can see me at Publix, you see me at sports games, you see the state attorney in the community, and that's really important for victims and for defendants to know that we're part of this community, and that's where accountability comes from.
We're almost out of time, but I can't let you leave without talking about your role as a teacher at UF. And I was particularly interested in the trial team work that you've done. And I was fascinated that you won a couple of national civil rights championships. Can you tell us about that fairly quickly?
Sure. That was one of the most fun experiences. So much work to get a team of law students ready to compete in a mock trial competition is a tremendous amount of work. We worked 5 days a week for weeks, rehearsing their cases and their parts, and every direct examination, cross-examination, closing argument, and then the competition that we entered was at St. John's University, right outside of Manhattan. There might have been some coincidence in why I picked that competition.
I know you like New York, Stacy.
I do love New York. So yeah, we went and competed against law schools from all over the country. I did it 3 years in a row. The first year we won. The second year we came in second.
Wow.
The third year we won, and then, like any good sitcom, I decided to go out when I was on top.
Of course. Leave them wanting more.
That's right. I was like, you can't top this.
And there was like a civil rights kind of theme to these, to the mock trials?
Yes. So the cases were actually not criminal mock trials. They were based around civil rights violations. Some of the cases were about like police abuse, excessive force, or they, could be a discrimination case of any type that implicated in 1983.
I have a friend who had a company called Legal Axe, and she used to work with the School of Law here, and she would hire people to play witnesses in the mock trials. And I had a blast doing that, really rehearsing and studying and researching the witness, and giving young lawyers or soon-to-be lawyers a hard time in trial. It was great. Well, it is amazing to talk to you. And I have been a big fan, as you know, for a long time. The work you do is so important, and we're very fortunate to have you.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
All right.
Great to see you.
Good to see you too.